Great, let's get started. Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you to the conference and Wade over there from Moov for putting this together. This is a lot of fun. I was here last year, had a great time and excited to be a speaker this year. So today we are going to talk about breaking boundaries, unleashing the power of multiple aggregators and a unified data model. So essentially, as we all know, or most of us probably know, building fintech applications is hard enough as it is. You have to have the right engineering team, the right folks in the right place, and you have to make sure you have the right providers. And many times aggregators are a core part of that. So in this workshop, we're going to delve into the technical aspects, challenges, and opportunities in building your fintech application using multiple aggregators. As part of this, we're going to talk about the design, implementation, and impact of unified data models and unified APIs. So a little bit about me and my colleague Zane. So I'm Ruben Izmailyan. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Quiltt. I'm a self-taught software engineer. I've spent about 15 years working across various roles in the financial data space. Previously, I was at a company called S&P Capital IQ. Generally, I'm a Rubyist. Also a big fan of GraphQL and React, which happen to be the technologies we use at Quiltt. I live in Dallas with my wife, two daughters, 2 cats, a Pittweiler, a lot of animals in the house. And I'll let Zane introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Zane. I've been programming now for close to 20 years, which feels longer every day. But before I joined Quiltt, I was over at Chime, part of the growth engineering, where we were focused on kind of the onboarding question of like bringing people onto the banking platform, which is a lot of dealing with APIs and trying to make sure that they're working as fast and smooth as possible. Day to day, I'm a full-time digital nomad, which makes me great for finding time zone related bugs. And I'll get back to Ruben. I'll be helping with the workshop towards the end.
Perfect. So just briefly go over the agenda. So we're going to keep it pretty simple. We're going to talk about key concepts and terminology. Everybody likes semantics. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the financial data landscape with a focus on sort of the account aggregation space. Then we're going to dive into unified APIs and the role they can play when we're working with financial data. And then finally, I'm going to hand it over to Zane, and we're going to do a coding exercise where we're actually going to get to apply some of these principles in action. Cool. So just to start with some key concepts, we're going to go ahead and kind of set some common language and definitions for some of the terminology we'll be working with. I think for many folks in the room, you're probably familiar with these things, but just to be thorough, we're going to go ahead and define some of the words, at least the way we think about them. So first, we're going to start with an API. So what is an API? It's essentially a set of rules and protocols that decide how software systems exchange data and initiate operations. Account aggregation. It's the practice of collecting, normalizing financial data from multiple financial institutions into one place, often served via an API. We're going to talk about abstraction layers. So an abstraction layer is a simplified interface that translates interactions with disparate systems into one format, masking complexity in the process. And then finally, this is going to lead us to a unified API. The unified API is an abstraction layer to translate multiple APIs and data formats into a single interface and data model. So what does a unified API look like in practice? We have a little illustration here. As you can kind of see over here, we have several different data sources that are returning information about a similar type of resource, in this case, a person. And you see some of the different types of fields and names that they can return. What the unified API will do is it will collect, sometimes in an opinionated manner, but generally applying some semblance of common sense to essentially model out what those fields all mean into a common data model. And that data model can then be used to power an application, which will allow you to essentially use multiple different data sources to present the same information, and usually with just a single integration into the unified API. So the unified API will take care of the translation with the underlying data sources and return a common data model. So next we're going to talk about the account aggregation space and what role account aggregators play today. So there's really sort of three core reasons account aggregators exist. Data is the lifeblood of pretty much all modern financial applications. So particularly when you're dealing with the complex financial lives of most folks, in America in particular, folks typically bank with lots of institutions or have financial products across many companies. We don't have too many super apps here. And so account aggregators play a really important role in providing us that data so we can embed it into our applications. There are thousands of banks, credit unions, and fintechs coming online. So we're talking about thousands of different data sets, formats, protocols to actually communicate with them. So account aggregators end up translating all of that for us into a more consistent format. And actually do the integrations with the banks, which leads me to the next point, which is that without account aggregators, getting the critical data we need to power our applications would be extremely onerous. It is probably no accident that many account aggregators actually came out of pivots as they themselves were building financial applications and had a really hard time integrating with the financial systems that they needed to access the data. I think most of us don't want to have to befriend all the COBOL engineers at the average bank. And so we're able to use an account aggregator to actually access that data that we need to power our applications. So the account aggregation space in the US, at least, which is what the focus of this is fairly well defined, I think. There's really four major incumbents in the space. Finicity, which is now part of MasterCard. MX, which is a company based out of Utah. They built their brand really on serving financial institutions. I believe they actually originally built a personal finance app themselves. There's Plaid, which is by now kind of a household name in fintech. They also started out as a PFM, interestingly enough, and they really built their brand on selling kind of bottom up to developers. They're kind of currently expanding into a lot of different products. And then finally, we have Yodlee, which was probably kind of the OG in this space. They were really around when a lot of this new wave of entrants entered the space. They're still a major player, and typically you'll see them more often in the kind of financial, like the investment management space. They do really well, which is where kind of the InvestNet connection comes into play. And then we also have all these sort of upstarts. It's probably weird to see Stripe as an upstart in a particular category, but they actually entered the space last year. They happen to actually use some of the incumbents under the hood to supplement the direct connections they're building themselves. We have Teller, Akoya, Softron, and a handful of others, right? So we're still seeing a lot of opportunity in this space. Companies are coming online and trying to make the aggregation experience easier and provide more choices for developers that are building financial applications. There's two major trends happening in this industry right now that I think are worth paying attention to. One is the shift away from screen scraping to OAuth, and second is the kind of emerging of common standards that are being developed to try to kind of tame the madness a little bit. So from screen scraping to OAuth, I'll talk a little bit about screen scraping. If unfamiliar with that in the context of account aggregation, it means that an application asks you for your bank logins. That information gets passed to the aggregator, and the aggregator will have something like a Puppeteer or similar type of browsing technologies that will essentially simulate the login into the bank, go and fetch the data, try to standardize it from a table into some kind of a format, and then serve it back to you. I think for those of you in this room that are technical, I don't need to tell you probably some of the pitfalls of that problem, right? So somebody changes their website, somebody moves something around probably changes a CSS variable, and these integrations tend to break. And so in general, nobody really likes screen scraping. This is there's broad consensus, I think, in this space between aggregators, banks, and consumers. Banks typically claim that screen scraping is insecure, which I think there's a lot of truth to that, because you're having to handle login credentials to the bank, which obviously have full read, write, transfer access. Those are being kind of passed around a lot. The aggregators typically don't want to maintain these brittle connections. It's a lot of engineering overhead for them. And in the end, of course, consumers, the actual end users of the data, often end up with brittle connections and data that maybe is not formatted well. I think we've all seen bank statements where we have no idea what Subway means. Is it a train or is it a sandwich? So a lot of that really comes from the fact that we're scraping for that data. So there's been a lot of progress over the last, I would say, 3 years to move over to OAuth. And so today, if you look at like the Plaids and the MXs, they'll each have over a dozen, in some cases, 24 institutions that are using OAuth connections. So when you try to use them, there'll be a screen that you'll actually get redirected to the Chase login screen. You'll handle that, and so we end up with these token-based connections, which are much more reliable. They make most people much happier, and overall, I think they, in our work, we've seen that the quality of connections is much higher. We see a lot fewer sort of disconnected accounts where people have to relog back in when folks use OAuth. I think one of the open questions with OAuth, of course, is what does the long tail look like, right? So it's great that we can get OAuth into Chase, but what about American Airlines Credit Union, right? So how is that going to play out? And so there's a broad number of organizations, between the cores and the aggregators that are sort of trying to help these institutions move over to OAuth. But typically this also requires bigger investment into sort of IT infrastructure for these institutions. Actually, interestingly enough, Plaid announced a product yesterday that's literally designed to help credit unions and banks essentially onboard onto Plaid's OAuth solution. MX has a similar product as well. So we're starting to see the aggregators actually do the direct outreach to the FIs to try to get them migrated over. And then let's talk about standards. So standards are hard. We start with 5 and we need another one and now we have 6, right? So standards are particularly hard to take effect when they don't have teeth behind them, which leads us to the sort of two kind of contrasting approaches to developing a common standard for financial data in the US and in the European Union. So in the US, we have basically gone down this consortium-based model through an organization called FDX. So FDX essentially is a voluntary consortium, lots of organizations, banks, credit unions, I believe all the major aggregators are essentially part of FDX, and FDX allows them to coordinate together and try to figure out essentially common ways to do stuff. From sort of our understanding of FDX, it's been heavily focused towards really driving folks away from credential sharing, moving more towards OAuth, and in general, kind of increasing operability of different systems. FDX in and of itself does not recommend a common data format. They do have a standard called ODX, which precedes FDX. It is an XML-based kind of protocol that describes how data should be essentially formatted and fetched. So it's a bit of an older approach, but a lot of financial institutions, of course, are typically, I think maybe a little bit behind in terms of the kind of technologies they use, and so it's certainly a huge improvement to have that common standard for folks. And then in Europe, we have kind of a slightly different approach where there's a framework called PSD2. PSD2 essentially has a lot more teeth. So it's essentially a regulatory kind of rule that defines how financial institutions have to provide access to customer data to external systems. There's some really interesting implications to this because the business models, I think, of the aggregators in the US and in the European Union are, as a result, very different, right? Because we have to have the aggregators go and actually get us the data, whereas in the EU, the banks actually are required to make this data available via API. If you're curious to learn more about this, I would kind of look into Plaid and some of these companies' sort of international strategies, and it's kind of interesting to follow. They're trying to create value in very different ways rather than the extraction of data. PSD2 is not really opinionated on data format. That's not really what it's about. It just basically, long story short, it says you have to have an API for your data. So let's talk about multiple providers and why somebody may want to run multiple providers, in this case, in the account aggregation space. So the first one is increased coverage, right? So no aggregator has 100% institutional coverage, and most of them actually are hesitant to publish a list, right? So if you go to Plaid and try to get the list of all their institutions, you're not going to see it on a public site, right? You'll generally need to set up an API keys. There might be some stuff in the dashboard where you can search, but typically you basically need to be working with the system to get a list of institutions. Same thing with most of the other aggregators, and to the degree that an institution is covered, that doesn't necessarily tell you that it's covered for the use case that you're using, right? So account aggregators can be used to sync account balance, transaction data. They can also be used to obtain ACH numbers to power payment flows. They can be used in some cases to get bank statements. And so there's a lot of granularity in terms of what institutions are covered by whom, as well as what types of products. And of course, everybody calls their products different things as well. And so, being able to run multiple providers typically allows you to make sure that you're not really missing customers that are not covered by the provider that you're using. The second kind of benefit is reducing infrastructure risk. Things go down, right? And that's just the reality of it. And so being able to potentially fall back to another provider in the case of sort of technical mishaps, particularly for payment-intensive workflows, is really important. And then finally, the third one is really managing sort of the vendor risk and pricing power. So negotiations with any fintech vendor can be sometimes a little bit difficult. It's especially difficult when you're effectively kind of like locked into a particular provider. I think there's an interesting kind of way where being able to theoretically sort of switch or to even try out new providers, I think gives more power to you as a developer of an application. It's just always good to have options. And so, why unified APIs and when should you reach for a unified API? So the main one really is when you need to orchestrate multiple providers, right? So a lot of the integration code is very different but the same. And so being able to kind of combine multiple providers through a single flow tends to bring a lot of benefits. When there are no canonical standards or obvious kind of take-all winners, right? So I don't think there's a unified API for dealing with like Stripe, for example, right? Because Stripe in a particular category really is perceived as the winner. Whereas in some other categories, like if you think about commerce data, right? Or employment systems, right? There are companies like Finch, there are companies like Merge. It's a very disparate ecosystem with a lot of different providers. And that's a place where being able to kind of have a unified approach to that makes a ton of sense. And account aggregation is another space like that as well. And then when you have many data sources and destinations to push to and to retrieve data from. And then finally, when you face constraints. So this could be time, this could be money, this could be engineering bandwidth. Typically, a unified API ends up being a more turnkey solution to actually getting live with the data. And so that's often, that's a big reason, I think, why most people start out or stick with these types of providers. Now, let's talk about why you might not need a unified API. Now, we're slightly biased here, just for full disclosure. So you might not need a unified API if you have lots of spare engineering bandwidth and your engineers just love writing repetitive code. This is a huge problem with Quiltt, as Zane can attest. So it's always a lot of fun. When you think your engineers will be able to swap out the systems on the fly when it's time. Of course, I don't need to go into the kind of changing plane parts in flight analogy, but oftentimes when you actually need this provider is often the most inopportune time to do it. When you think that you can kind of build it right in-house from the beginning. This absolutely may be true for many companies. For a lot of companies early starting out, I think particularly when kind of you're not familiar with a particular domain, it often makes sense to reach essentially for the expertise of a provider that has that domain and actually is able to kind of translate the quirks of underlying systems into something that is probably a little bit easier to work with. And then finally, when you don't have more important stuff to worry about. So just to recap, the financial data landscape, it's complex, it's rapidly evolving, there's new vendors coming online, there are changes happening to the underlying, the main vendors as well, and so that often requires maintaining a lot of kind of updates and keeping things, continuing to develop on things that you've already built. Multiple data providers often bring technical, operational, and business benefits. And then unified APIs can unlock those multiple providers without you having to build a lot of the in-house infrastructure. So I want to kind of open up the floor for any questions. Happy to take it as sort of technical or non-technical as folks are interested in. And then I'll hand it over to Zane. Yes?
You talked about the data. What about the user experience on the unified front? Like, is that also unified? Like, do they see one experience regardless of what aggregator?
Yeah. So the question was, what about the user experience? So we know sort of the back-end part. Do the users see the same or a similar type of experience when they're connecting? Is that correct? Yeah. So that's a great question, and I think one of the things that we've observed with kind of APIs like Rudder, Merge, some of the kind of major sort of players in the unified API space is there's usually a front end piece too, right? So the back end piece is probably the more technically kind of complex problem to solve, but the front end piece is the thing that actually makes people use the thing, right? And so there's really kind of two approaches, the simple approach, and kind of we at Quiltt really started off with this approach, and it ended up being a mistake, was to basically kind of, in the case of, I'll talk about Plaid and MX, right? So Plaid has a front-end module called Plaid Link, and you need to go through Plaid Link to authenticate the user. MX has a similar system called MX Connect. And so our sort of assumption was that, well, the front-end part is a little bit easier, right? So we'll just kind of give them some instructions to set up Plaid Link and MX Connect a certain way, and then we'll be able to essentially translate that data and do our thing, our like fancy thing on the back end. But one of the things we learned is that from the customer sort of our end clients, like they still had to go and write those integrations. So in other words, they still have to do one integration for each provider, but these integrations are now a little bit trickier than just following the straight tutorials from the site. And so oftentimes when that happens, you'll see kind of unified APIs actually build their own front-end kind of equivalents to the back-end piece. So essentially it's an orchestration layer. In the case of what we do, we basically have a thing called the connector, and the connector kind of handles the complexity. It's an abstraction layer on the front end pieces as well. So when you set up the front end widget, it's already pre-configured with the right defaults and the right things, so it becomes much more turnkey. And so now you can hand this to a client, and there's a front end piece that's kind of taken care of that handles the underlying things on the front end that the end user has to do. They still are going to go through the full Plaid or MX onboarding experience. That's not something that, at least in our space, given how regulated it is and how sort of many rules there are, that's not something that you can bypass or that I would recommend bypassing. And then finally, when that flow is completed, the sort of the back end magic and the actual probably the core IP that you've done is really that's when it starts to come into play. Does that answer the question? Awesome. Any other questions? Yes.
Quiltt is providing a unified data model to the customers, and do you have a model that you can integrate with other customers or other aggregators, or do you have to still
So I think the question was, if at Quiltt we have essentially a standard data model, or if the client has to interact with the underlying data models of the sources we integrate. So I think this is actually one of the things that really makes a unified API in any context. I think you have to have a common data model, just because APIs are quirky, right? So if you think about most API-based businesses, everybody wants to be Stripe, right? And what makes Stripe really amazing is a lot of things, but one of them is that they kind of have like an interesting API, right? They have some patterns that they've introduced that are probably that were like unfamiliar to people, and it was like, oh, this is so cool. And I think you see a lot of API businesses that will try to do that, right? They'll come up with some interesting pattern or something really cool that will make them stand out. And so when you then add up like 3 or 4 of these types of providers, each of them has these quirks that you then have to like keep in mind as you're building it. And so I think that's one of the big values of any kind of a unified API, is to actually apply deep domain expertise. And this is why I think making it, like if you're trying to build a unified API in a particular space, I think the number one thing that you need is like to have people on your team that like really understand the space, that have actually worked with one or more of these providers, that have built stuff, run them in production, right? And like understand that things aren't necessarily how they look sometimes. And so that turning that domain expertise into a somewhat opinionated data model, I think, is really important. So in the case of the aggregation space, right? So does anybody know what Plaid calls a connection? Item. That's kind of interesting, right? That's not intuitive, I think, for if you're like brand new to the aggregation space, like what's an item? Like what's a Plaid item? Item is a very, very generic term for something, right? And does anybody know what MX calls a connection? Member, there you go, perfect. So a member is not a user. So there's users and then there's members, but a member is a connection. And so when you're working with these types of systems, I think most engineers can keep multiple ideas in their heads pretty quickly, right? That's why we do what we do. But if you need to be context switching, oh, over here it's an item, over here it's a member, but it's actually a connection. Those are, I think, some of the kind of low-hanging fruit opportunities to say, you know what, it's a connection, right? And that connection in Plaid speak means item, and in MX speak it means member. And being able to kind of take this down into a particular, let's take like an account number, right? So somebody might say like fingerprint, or somebody might say like mask, or somebody might say numbers, right? So at a certain point, you have to pick a name for those last 4 digits of an account that typically get exposed. And there are risks in that, right? Because how do you know that your abstraction is sort of correct? So, for us, I think Zane can probably agree with this. This has sometimes meant moving maybe slower than we would like on some new abstractions, because we want to kind of test it a little bit with ourselves, with some customers, and actually like get people's thoughts as to what's intuitive. But having that common data model, I think, is really, really critical, because otherwise, all you've really done is kind of created a routing layer between different APIs, which can also be valuable, but then you're not actually delivering kind of the value of having the same, not having to switch mental models when you're potentially using similar things. And that's what the workshop is going to touch on quite a bit. So thank you for the question. Yes, exactly. You write a translation layer, and our definition of a unified API has to have that. Yes? So I think there's a few approaches to take there. Kind of in our context, we're integrators and resellers. I think it really depends on the space. I think if you're integrating or kind of creating a unified API over services that are fairly easy to self-serve onto, it probably makes more sense to just create a good experience for people to pop in their API keys. And so in our case, we support that too. But I think when you're integrating sort of providers that, and in finance, oftentimes, self-serve is of limited use, right? There are certain products you can self-serve onto, but because of obviously fraud and compliance, typically self-serving is more difficult for production. But yeah, typically, if your domain requires a more onerous onboarding process, I think building good relationships with the underlying providers is really important. And the way you do that is you provide value to them, right? Which is help their customers or a particular subset of their customers get live faster. And typically, like, we've had a lot of success kind of like having those type of discussions. Yes, wait.
You had said the different aggregators have different coverage and then obviously availability or redundancy. Do the different providers have different data? Or like, would you ever get a loan interest rate through one provider from Bank of America, maybe not get that same data from somebody else?
I'm going to let Zane take that one. So here you go, Zane.
It's very situational. So like broadly, yeah, they can have different. Usually they'll be pretty similar. Like 9 out of 10 times, like if they both have the provider, they'll generally have the same capabilities. But yeah, sometimes you'll see where it's like, okay, like especially when you get past the base like account and transaction style of information, where it's like, okay, a loan product or something, that's an additional package on top of MX and Plaid, and then the way those additional packages will show up, or even if they have that package, will difference. And like one of the biggest ones I actually see most commonly is like account verification, which is often used for like moved money operations, where like MX versus Plaid will just kind of not always have overlap and will have very different. So you might sign someone up through a Plaid and you want to collect money from this account, but it turns out that you need to go through MX to collect money from this account. And so then it's like, okay, how do you navigate that? How do you switch them over to like the one that you want?
So just to add to that, I think one recommendation like that we have, and I would recommend to other folks building this, is find a way to expose the raw data, right? So abstractions are lossy by default. If you take something that, this person has 10 fields, this person has 10 fields, and you throw away the fields that are like random to you and focus on the 7 fields that are sort of common and important in your opinion, that might not be the opinion of your customer. And frankly, I think from the point of view of the provider that you're integrating, yeah, you're maybe making their product easier to use, but you're also dropping some stuff that they have that they might find really important, right? And so finding a way to preserve the raw data so that for customers that need that one provider has and the other one doesn't, finding a way to actually give them a path to still get that, I think is really important, so that you can give them the benefit of the common data model, but you're not letting them lose the ability to get the raw data that they would have gotten if they went direct. Yes, a question in the back over there. I think that gentleman in the very back had a hand up. Sorry.
Good. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought. If it's not asking too much detail, how do you go about exposing raw data? Do you have like different sort of schemas for each data source?
So you.
Like just
Repeat the question.
one data source, what their raw data looks like, or do you kind of show it in like a unified model and say here's like the raw version of that value and here's like our unified translator?
Yeah. So the question is like, how do we expose like raw data within our API? We actually like play with this directly in the workshop, and it's the first things we'll go through because we don't want to spend months setting up an integration. It needs to be an hour-long workshop. But yeah, one of the systems that I built, which thankfully saved us a lot of time, but was a pain, was we actually have a system that like interpolates the gems and the documentation of our providers and rolls those up into types and converts it to expose it to the API. So there's like a little bit of shift in there where like the camel case might change on the field types, but overall we're able to just basically directly take their API and then pass out their data completely clean, the same that they would provide. And so that way we're able to have that like one-to-one, like this is exactly what you'd get from them. And so it makes it a lot easier, especially when we're like, okay, I don't know if this is a feature we want to like standardize quite yet, because we don't know what the standard of this kind of looks like. But we can go, you can always dig down and access the raw data. We never hide that.
Also, is it like the whole kind of raw response you provide somewhere?
We do have a way that we provide that. It's not in our like client-facing API. It's our server-server API, where we've started exposing kind of like the caching layer of how we talk to APIs. So like our ETL process will like talk to an API, download that, and then we'll separately process it for intake. And so we've started offering just exposure. So if you want to like walk through the raw data or like ETL that to your own process, because maybe you're running machine learning or you're running something that is like a different sort of thing, you can just kind of actually pull out that as a single cache. And also that means you don't have to hit like 5 endpoints to get the thing, because we already just like, here's the list.
Awesome, thank you.
Yes?
I'm curious, how do you deal with, and how do you scale the integrations when, underneath providers may change their APIs and introduce logs and things get great?
Yeah, I mean, so,
Repeat the question.
sorry, the question is like, how do we scale along with the providers or the vendors who are introducing new APIs and changing and introducing bugs? Paradoxically, I think it honestly gets a little bit easier the more providers you provide. And it's kind of for 2 reasons. Like, one is as you get more unified with your data model, it's easier to have more things fit into it because you figured out this is the problem space. Like, the magic really happens at 3. Like, whenever I'm building anything, I always look at least 3 to see like what they have in common, because then you can sort of triangulate it. But another thing is like, funny enough, like, we're all human. We all kind of work in the same problem space, so we happen to generally make the same types of bugs. And so like when a vendor makes a bug, like it's often very categorically similar in the bug. It might, be categorically misparsing the way that like Wells Fargo's website presents transaction data, and you might see that bug in another provider. So like it might not be Wells Fargo for the other provider, but it will be that similar bug. So like as you start handling these bugs on one, you're able just to retool that technology and be like, okay, we noticed this bug exists in these places, turn on the handler for those places.
Yes?
I had a question, like, how do you handle source of truth and like conflict resolution when you've got data types that are coming in, maybe from different aggregators, and like, let's just take like a daily account balance or something that's different. Like how at scale, like through my application, do I kind of start choosing like, all right, in these cases we're going to choose this aggregator or this. What does that kind of look like in a unified model?
Yeah. So the question is around like, how do you pick the source of truth when you're servicing data from multiple providers? Kind of the unglorious, like easy answer is you pick one. And now might not always be the same for like depending on the feature. You might use one for this and one for the other. But like when it comes to like account balances and transactions, generally both for like the underlying cost reasons of having active connections, but also just like the usability for the end customer having to go through a flow once, you'll generally want to use one at a time. And that might change over the time as like a connection breaks. You might take that opportunity to migrate them over to the one that you prefer. But then you just will splice the data together and then run forward on that. And so you end up less conflicts because you're not actually trying to resolve which one's right at this time, because they're generally right at the time that you're looking at them. And then the conflicts become around how do you splice. And that's just, you take a little bit of heuristic, and like, honestly, the thing that I usually do is much like sewing something together, is you put them together, you overlap them, and then you snip out the parts, a little bit of the overlap, to make sure that like that edge data doesn't have anything that's like extra or lossy in it, but you actually have a full seam of continuous data that isn't going to have a mismatch in expectations.
How do you decide which providers to work with? Have they caused you headaches to the point where you just ditch them? Because I know I've worked with a few of those, and some were horrible.
The question was, how do you decide which providers to work with? I'll leave it there. I think that's a good question. For us, is really working with the sort of our end customers and what they're looking for, right? There's no magic answer to it. I think it's very subjective. Making sure that we have partners that, frankly, are kind of on board with what we're doing as well, and understand the benefits that this brings to their customers, and to them being able to bring folks online, I think is also valuable. But I would say that pretty much every provider we've added after like our first one has been a customer coming to us and saying, hey, I really want to use you guys, but I also really want to use this. What do you think? And we'll go through our process and sort of evaluate and say, well, like, we've been wanting to integrate these guys anyway, right? Like we have a list of providers in various categories. that we want to integrate with as sort of resources and kind of time is permitting. And so then we'll say, okay, well, let's move this one up a little bit. So it is very like, I think, it's a function really of the stage of the company you're at too. I think for us, it's really listening to our customers. But in general, we try not to. We have our own opinions maybe sometimes, but we try not to like, I think each provider has some benefits, right? And some of them are really good at one thing and not so good at the other thing. I think giving folks choices, I think, is really important, and that's really the core problem that we're looking to solve. Is I think people have a lot of choices in theory, but they have to like early on sort of pick one and go down that path, and then maybe be disappointed because something didn't really work out for them. And I think we want to have the type of platform where people can sort of pick one in the beginning, and hopefully it's the right one for them. But then if there's a problem, right, they can solve the problem with one by supplementing the other one, rather than going and sort of like tearing and replacing these things out. I think and that's one of the reasons why I think a unified API is sort of like pitch to customers is that, hey, like, you can just rip and replace providers left and right. I don't think that's really good, and I don't think that's good for the customers really, or the ecosystem overall. I think the pitch really needs to be that, hey, we make it easier for you to integrate this, and then if there's like a problem with this, A, we'll try to help you solve it, but B, right, you'll have some other approaches to come and sort of more gracefully handle that problem rather than kind of going nuclear on your code base, because nobody wants to do that.
And to add to that, I think like one kind of element is like you look at the cost of an API provider. Like there seems to be a relationship between the cost and the ease of implementation. So as like a new startup, you have to balance those, and often you're looking for speed. So you're willing to pay a bit more basis points per action, given that you will be able to deploy this maybe in a couple weeks. But then as you scale and you're looking to like get your margins to be more sustainable, you're gonna be like, okay, actually, 3% of that entire transaction for every one of these does not necessarily make sense for the type of load that we're trying to do. And so then you'll end up taking your now, hopefully more resources to kind of work through and get a better solution. Unified APIs kind of like make that even easier, because like you might still need to do that transition, but if you're starting at a unified API, that instead of being like months of engineering time to retool as you're trying to like optimize the cost basis, you're just like, okay, we're ready to like move to a little more hands-on approach. Click.
Cool. All right, we'll take, if there's one more question, we'll take it. Otherwise, we'll move on. Yes?
So today you're providing account aggregation. Are you planning on providing verification, enrichment, all those other things later?
The question is, what we're providing today. Like, I think having a multi-product solution for a particular vertical, I think is important. I think you have to be sort of thoughtful around how you do it. For us, in our case, we've started with a couple of products, account aggregation, sort of verification being the two, identity verification being another one. But I think you also have to, you generally have to try to stay in a lane, just because it makes more sense to building things like this to go deep than to try to go too wide. I think eventually there's time probably to go too wide, but these things are complicated, right? So in our case, our approach has been to try to go deep as much as we can and become really good at like this one thing, and then the ancillary things become much easier to expand into. Great, thank you everybody for the questions. I'm gonna hand it off to Zane, and we're gonna do some coding. And if you don't have a computer, you'll be able to follow along. And we have a couple of me and Tom over there are happy to move around and help folks with any problems, setup problems.
Yeah, if you run into any issues, just like raise your hand. One of them will come around. We're gonna be working on sort of building our own little personal finance app thing. Really the goal with this is that walking out here today, you should be able to play a bit with your own data in a React environment in the way that you'd want to play with it. And so to hand wave some of this, we've gone ahead and kind of exposed the raw data from our integrations for MX and Plaid. And so we're going to build up on top of that and then kind of work through what the implications and how you might craft those into a unified API before moving on to like our unified API as an example of that. So to get started, if everyone could go ahead and download and clone this repo, and just give me kind of like a quick show of hands of who is going to be following along with this. so that I can keep track of everyone. Thank you. So yeah, go to GitHub and then Quiltt/fintech DevCon.
I have a question for the room or for anybody for the Wi-Fi. This is the first presentation I've attended, so I just don't know which one.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's a funny password. Awesome, thank you.
Anybody else need the Wi-Fi? Yeah, actually. Good. And what was the funny password? What's the password? It's hot. Yeah. Yes, it is. Lowercase, no apostrophe. Cool. Thanks, everyone. Does anybody need help cloning repo? You guys running into issues?
Some of those things where I wish I could put up a QR code, but you still wouldn't be able to scan it. Okay, so this is the repo. Just kind of, let me know when everyone has it downloaded. And then, if you're familiar with Node and like React projects, it's pretty standard npm install. Is anyone here not familiar with these technologies that we're using? Just so give the appropriate attention. Do you have Node installed? Okay. So yeah, you should be able to follow this, and it should pretty much auto set up. Anyone see that?
Yeah, I've overlooked these quick install steps. Here's easy steps. So I'll go through the
That sucks. I, many moons ago, used to work for CVS Health, and their corporate firewall would scan for words like proxy and disable it, but it took a week before the ban list caught up. So you'd download a package, you'd build something, a week later, everything stops.
But would you agree like NPM has to be a whitelist because you can download anything?
Yeah.
NPM, right? And
Yeah.
you don't even know what's happening. It's just NPM.
Yeah. Okay, has everyone more or less got it downloaded? Cool.
Yeah, so I'll just be patient with it. JavaScript.
Okay, so once you have it downloaded and you have your packages installed, you should be able to run it, and it should boot up a little server to localhost on 3000, as long as you didn't accidentally leave one of your other projects running. And so you should see this screen. And so this is going to be like a little bit demo project that we're able to kind of work through. Now, the way that this is structured is we have a bit where you can choose whichever API you want to work with first, MX or Plaid, and then we'll kind of fill that out, and then we'll come back together. And so if you're not caught up, that's okay. If you're still trying to install, we'll have some time to work through that. But yeah, so you'll pick the API that you want to work with first, MX and Plaid, and you go up to the top. And so I'll click on MX and wonder why it's not loading. And then you need to log in. And so I'm going to use Sandbox. You can use Sandbox too, but if you want to play with your live data, which is honestly far more interesting, click Live and log in that way. But this will take you to our Quiltt hub. And so log in here or sign up here. This will just do a quick little sign up prompt. And then this is our Quiltt hub. It gives us a couple options in terms of today's development. We're at the top here. You can click on local development. That will pop up this screen, which will then redirect us back to that local web server that we're running with a session. And like that, you have now done the week plus work of integrating MX, and ta-da! We now have MX integrated to your local development environment. So you should be able to see this screen. From there, you can launch the aggregator of your choice and go ahead and sign up for an account, which I think it's MX Bank and password if you're signing up with MX. It's user_good, pass_good for Plaid, which Plaid thankfully tells you. MX, you have to memorize that. Oh, it's not. Ruben, what's the password for MX for the demo?
MX user?
Yeah.
Correct.
Oh, correct.
I think it's actually the wildcard. I think
I just tried password. Okay, so this redirects us back. So in the background, does some syncing. This doesn't have WebSockets hooked up. So if you do a quick refresh, it will then load all the raw data for MX, which takes a bit of a second because it's all the data. So you should see this. This is what MX gives us. So you can see here's like our connection. You can see like here's the information they give us for the accounts. And then you keep going a bit, you'll find the transactions. And so now our job is to pull that into an actual component. So inside the project, you look at the root of the project, there's app, root, private are the pages we're going to be working on. And so there's Plaid and MX. So I'm working on the MX one, so open up the MX page here. And we have some pre-made components for you, because again, this needs to take not weeks. So we can go ahead and import, we'll start with a transaction. And so if we save and refresh this, you can see that we have this styled out transaction card that has some data in there that's been hard-coded. So for the next part, we need to actually bring in our transaction data. So if we look at the transaction card, we can go ahead and start adding props. Which showed you. And so this is the part where we start making like choices about how we're binding the data. And so then inside our card, we can set, what was that? The date. The description. And the amount. So then come back here, and we want to start passing in that data. Yeah. That better? So I'm just going to cheat and pull in the first. So if we look back at our data, we get compilation errors. We can see that the keys that we want to use are date, amount, and description. So we go back to our page, come out the code block. We can see, cool, we have a transaction of live data. And so that seemed easy enough, right? We integrated all of MX, 20 minutes or less, just like they sold. So it's like, okay, now business trucks on, wheel misfortune. Uh-oh, unexpected vendor outage. MX is down, or maybe that bank is down, or the connection with MX and that bank is particularly affected. Our customers can no longer sign up for our application. Crap, what do we do? Okay, we have to implement someone else. So we go and buy something else off the shelf and start plugging it in. And at this point is the point that most people start comparing the data models between your two APIs. Because before this, it's like it doesn't matter. You just got the amount, you plug in the amount. And so, make this a little bit bigger. So here I have two examples, the same transaction, Spotify, one from MX and one from Plaid. And so they have, similar description, same date, they have the same amount. Okay, looks good, so I can just plug it in and go. First thing that I would notice though is the amount is positive. This is something that's often very overlooked, is like the average person who is using data, financial data as a developer, we're used to money leaving our accounts. So when we go to do math on any of the account data, we're expecting it to be money leaving. Spotify did not pay me $10 to use their service. I wish, but I paid them. So that's one thing that, like, you import the data, you're often importing it in the way that banks think about it and not the way that we think about it. So that's a bug that developers might run into, but that's also like our version of the transaction card. This is actually a bug we introduced right here in the amount. We showed the amount in the wrong polarity to the end customer. And so you might catch that after a little bit of usability testing, but you might not. So like that's one little tidbit, but then like keep looking. Okay, so we have another transaction here. This is a refund, and we look at the amounts again. We notice that they have different polarities. The data doesn't match. Why is that? Well, Plaid stores whether it's a debit or a credit in the amount by doing positive or negative, but MX always stores the amount as a positive and then tells you whether it's a debit or a credit. So even though it's just transaction, which is 3 points of data that you think would be universally true, there's actually different ways just to transmit the amount. And so that overhead and that introduction of bugs, if you do it immediately, ends up being where a lot of the hardship can be. Because like you thought it was simple, it's just a transaction amount. When's that ever been wrong? But you start doing math on that or merging those data together, you'd be like, oh, these aren't, you try to deduplicate these transactions, these would look like different transactions. And so that's where you start running into the problems with like having multiple APIs. So now if we look at, you could wrap this up and create a unified API. And so if we go back, we look at the unified page. So here I've set up same thing we were doing before. So we can, let my window go. Go back to, so go to new tab, unified, and we can bring over the work that we did on creating this transaction card. And start making a query. So our API is a GraphQL API. We find this is really helpful, particularly in the problem space of unifying APIs, because it allows it to be expressive in multiple ways, right? You don't have to fixate on the like, here's exactly the data that you're going to want to use, but it allows you to merge together the data into a coherent model and then only select parts of that model that you want. So in this case, we're going to want transactions. And then we need to figure out what part of the data. So if you go back to Quiltt Hub or sandbox.quilthub and sign back in again, I did not type my name right. We have this feature at the top, GraphQL Explorer, which can make it really easy to sort of like walk through the data that we want playing with. So we're going to be looking at transactions. So expand out nodes. In GraphQL, always grab the ID. This is just important for caching. If you don't have the ID, like the tools you're using will get angry, even if you don't like need the ID for anything. Grab the date, grab the amount, and then we can grab the description. But see that? And so here we can see transactions, right? They now have normalized polarity. We're not having them all be positive unexpectedly. And if we're bringing in from Plaid or MX, they'll have the same value. So we can go ahead and take this query, bring it over here, and then comes out. Why are you upset? The joys of TypeScript. Yeah, I need to generate the types first. I'll just comment this out. Yeah. So we come back here. We can grab our session and stuff it in .env, which you can clone from .env.example. This session allows you your tooling locally here in this project to talk to the introspection of our GraphQL server. So now, we can run npm, I guess bigger. Okay, I don't know how to make that bigger. But we can run npm GraphQL : codegen. Or in my case, pnpm. And that should generate fancy types for us. So now we should do get transactions query. Come this stuff back in. Go back to our transactions card. Nodes. Right. Yeah, nodes. Dot. Oh. That's fine. Make sure we import our transactions card. And now we have the same thing, built under our unified data. And so what's nice about this is like now I have Max, I can go and link a Plaid account. And see that we have new transactions from Plaid. And it works with our same components. So front-end developer, so we did all this in the front end as an example, but you'd do most of this logic, right? On the back end, where we hand-waved it. And so now a front-end developer doesn't have to worry about like the differences between this data. And I think like that's the biggest thing when you're working on like integrating any API, even if it's not a unified like model, is figure out how you can unify that API for the way that you want to use that API. Otherwise, you're just going to introduce bugs. Like the fact that like transaction amounts are in banking and accounting terms and not in the terms that we as developers think of is the quickest way to have math bugs in any of your like related things, whether you're trying to do graphing or you're trying to like give people bonuses or roundups or like any of those little features, like that's just a quick bug waiting to happen. So it's not just about like translating it, I think, from like what the API wants to what the business needs, but also thinking about how is the developer gonna like work with this at 3 a.m. while on call, and can we make it easier for that? And so once you have it unified, you can ship that to the front end, and then it's a lot easier for everything behind the hood just to swap out or make adjustments as needed. So like in this case, if there was a problem with a particular integration on a vendor, we could have that person just relink on Max instead of Plaid, or on Plaid and Max, and we just behind the scenes would swap over their data. And it would be completely seamless to the experience that they're getting, the experience the front end developer is getting. Any questions? Yeah.
How do you do consent management? Because as I understand, the vendors who own the user consent, right, to the plan. So
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple layers of that, which kind of fall into like legal compliance and risk. The biggest thing is like, as you saw, we're going through the flow, like we're still utilizing, like here's the MX widget, we're still utilizing the Plaid widget. So that most specific part of like giving consent about sharing the data, honestly the banking partner, specifically when you get closer to like OAuth, like really owns. And so we're trusting that like MX isn't stealing the data. We're trusting that Plaid isn't stealing the data. And so our relationship is with Plaid in this case, and Plaid's relationship is with the customer in that very specific.
what I meant is like creating like buttons for the user to say like connection on or off.
Oh, yeah.
And do they have consent? Like do you have also unified a consent API that
Yeah, so
essentially
we've unified all the interactions you do with a connection. So disconnecting, adding it, yeah. You generally like anytime you're working on a problem that you want to unify it, it's really important. I think also like you're going to unify the main happy path, but also unify like the unhappy paths. And like one of the like things you'll see working on like other API like domain problems is they won't always have the same paths. Like some of them will do like action A, B, and C, and one of them will do like B and C. It's sometimes really helpful to treat them all the same though. So even if like I were to say, I want you to do action A with the vendor that doesn't support it, you might be able to like emulate that behavior, or you might be able to like just log that like they clicked on that. Because ultimately you want the experience from the user to be the same, and then on the back end you figure out. And so I've done that a lot with like integrating like APIs going to a front end widget where it's like one vendor had like 5 steps that we needed to talk to their API, and the other vendor had 3 steps. And so in theory the front end could only talk back to our server 3 times when implementing the other vendor. And that would, in theory, be less code because it's less actions. But ultimately, it actually ends up adding a lot more complexity because then you're like, am I using vendor A or vendor B? So on those extra 2 calls that it called back and did nothing, that's where we put our analytics. So every time it called back, we did analytics. And so we always knew where our user was down in the pipeline, even if the API didn't like have a need for that callback. We still knew that they got that far in the pipeline, even though it's like an asynchronous process that's happening. So like anytime that you have a touch point, figure out like how you can make it valuable for you, even if it's not like a hard requirement with someone you're integrating with. Any other questions? Yeah.
As far as like the common fields you get from the different aggregators, which ones are the hardest to like unify? I mean, the transaction's kind of a good example.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you run anything that's just like
Simple on that?
It sort of depends how you look at it. Like, I think one is like talking about accounts. Kind of a good example is talking about like a last 4 mask. Everyone like uses very different words to use it. And I think when you like approach a problem like that, you have to actually look at like what you're trying to solve. Because like last 4 in most cases will be most precisely correct, right? Like in most standard accounts, you're gonna get the last 4 digits and that's fine. But in the cases in which you're doing something that might be like outside of like standard accounts, it might be like crypto, or it might be just like something else that isn't like number-based account record keeping, then it might be a mask. And so like calling it last 4 actually kind of limits, I think, the precision and the accuracy of using your API because you unified it to a very specific thing, when a mask being a superset was actually more easy to work with. But when you're also like talking, that's like the label. When you talk about the data itself, descriptions on a transaction, no, those aren't going to match. And those aren't even going to match like based on the API, but they also won't match like based on the bank. Like you can have the same transaction hit 5 different banks, and they'll all just come up with a different description. And so that's one of those where it's like, you sort of just pick one. If you have enrichment, you enrich them and massage them together and try to like clean it up and get to something more canonical. But ultimately, like you learn that like, stuff like descriptions, if you're doing any sort of logic, is good if you're trying to pull together multiple transactions that have the same date and the same amount. But if you don't, you just like don't even look at the description because you're like, I know it's going to be this. It's the only one on that day. And so like hard numbers or hard data ends up being a lot more reliable than trying to like do complicated string diffing based on like non-deterministic patterns.
Those are like free text. Those are like where if you use your cards, so like Walmart or something, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the same transaction could appear multiple places with like slightly different descriptions.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Descriptions are like the biggest bane because like the entire like transaction data market, especially on like credit cards, but like ACH is like, it's a CSV. It's like, what 22 characters can you fit in a CSV? Which is not a lot of context. Like, if we could rebuild the money movement, network of the world and have a JSON in there, it'd be amazing. But you have 22 character CSV because someone needs an FTP server to not go down. Yep. All right. No other questions? I think we're done. Thank you all for coming and working through this.